Decided to throw this up here mainly so you could get like a mental picture. This isn't something I need you to write down or something that is going to be on the test, but it's just a really helpful, I think, mental picture of where we're going in Leviticus. So again, we're looking at the first 7 chapters, and that really starts off with this this first section that have to deal with the sacrifices and the rituals. Now, you're going to see a parallel to this later on in the book of Leviticus from chapters 23 through 25, and you see what is called like this chiasmic organization to the book, with the central idea being this Day of Atonement. We're all leading up to the Day of Atonement in chapter 16, and they're going to be pulling away from the Day of Atonement. And then right here at the bottom, you have consequences of obedience and disobedience that are kind of like its own section in the book of Leviticus. We are looking at these kinds of offerings, and again, this is a mental picture for you, understanding where we've been and where we're trying to head. So we've already spent time covering the burnt offering and the things that God listed and entailed in what was required of this sacrifice. We're going to look today at number 2 through 5. And again, to get in your mind, you have these first 3 chapters being voluntary sacrifices. We noted the King James translation in chapter 1 uses that language in verse 3. This ought to be a voluntary sacrifice. And then you have what is known as obligatory sacrifices or required sacrifices for certain things. And we're going to get into why that might be. But we're going to look at chapter 2 and get into what's called the grain offering. And these are titles that come from the New American Standard translation of the Bible. If your Bible says something different, know that we're still talking about the same thing. But we get into chapter 2. This grain offering is really, another way to think about it, a Thanksgiving offering. It's something that you are choosing to offer or give to God because of what He's given to you. So you see the language that's found here in the way that you, in verse 3, prepare this offering and what's going to happen with it. This grain offering as an offering to the Lord. His offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. So you have this uncooked grain offering. In verses 4 through 7, you have the cooked offerings. Or maybe another way to look at this is different preparations or the specificity of what to do with this offering that you've prepared. And then verses 8 through 10, you have the procedure of what to do with this offering. And again, one of the things that we're starting to notice now is this, again, is not for atonement. It's not for getting yourself right with God. This is simply a way of expressing gratitude to God. And why might that be important? Why is it important to express our gratitude to the Lord? If you don't understand who the source of your blessings comes from or who the source is, then you're not going to continue to show gratitude, and you're going to become disgruntled. If you're not grateful for the things you have, you're going to be looking for an answer, looking for something more. And really, we need to understand that God is the source of our blessing, and we need to see that. When we fail to see that, we're going to get into trouble. So then God here in chapter 2 instructs that you give of the first fruits. Why might that be difficult? So I think there's some truthfulness to both those statements. Is the first fruit the best? Well, oftentimes it can be, or it is. And what if there's not more to come? What if I give God my first harvest and more doesn't show up later? Well, now I put myself in a bind. Now I put some danger into my life. And so this concept of giving to God the best is one that we're going to see in the sequential chapters. That we are going to be invited to give God the best. And God is aware of what He's asking us to do. God is aware of potential risks that we put ourselves in giving to Him the best and the first. And one other thing I wanted to note that I was noticing in the reading today is, where is this offering prepared? This grain offering. Is it something that you do right then and there when you get to the tabernacle or the temple? But where's your oven? At your house, right? At your home. That really caught my attention in reading chapter 2 because I caught something that I'd never noticed in studying Leviticus, that in order for you to get into the right mindset of bringing your offering to God, this is something that you have had to thought about and have planned for back at your home. And there's great parallels that you can make from that, these first 10 verses of Leviticus 2 to where we're at today. That if you're going to really be devoted to God, if you're going to give thankfulness to God, if you're going to show your gratitude towards God, why wouldn't you start at the home? Like, why wouldn't that be your jumping point for where you're going to start preparing these things? And then you bring this offering and you don't participate in it. Like, again, that catches my attention because the one who gets this offering is the Lord and then the priest. So, again, you have this idea of total sacrifice. This is costly to you. And then you have to battle against the mindset, well, this is my grain. This is my cake that I prepared. And yet I don't get to enjoy this. Others are the beneficiaries of it. So, when you do this, though, the result is the same that we looked at last week or on Sunday, that verse 9, this is a soothing aroma to the Lord. So this is a true sacrifice because there is no benefit necessarily for the offerer. It's just a thanksgiving or a showing of gratitude to the Lord. Questions or comments through verse 10? So then we get into this section of, let me see where I'm at on the PowerPoint. Then we get into the section of this covenant or the salt of the covenant in verse 13. And a couple verses that I asked y'all to read in preparation. Numbers 18:19. All the heave offerings of the holy things which of the children of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and daughters with you as an ordinance forever. It is the covenant of salt forever before the Lord with you and your descendants with you. 2 Chronicles 13 says, do you not know that the Lord of God of Israel gave the rule over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? So what is some of the imagery that comes to mind when you hear or think of salt, especially as used in the biblical texts? Okay, so what do you mean by that? Okay, so distinct, the language of the salt of the earth. So we are seasoning the earth, as called by Jesus to do as his Christians, as his disciples. Some other things. Yes, Mike?
Preservation or preserving qualities.
Okay, so it keeps things from perishing. It makes them last longer. Anything else? So when you read these verses and you see the language being used, what is the conclusion that you're supposed to get from these verses? What is the salt of the covenant representing in these verses? Maybe not something so distinct, maybe a little bit more towards the preservation.
The word I see is forever.
They're enduring.
Something that's preserved forever. It's an enduring relationship.
Absolutely. That's the idea that's supposed to come to mind as we read this text then in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, so that the salt of the covenant your God shall not be lacking from your grain offering. So I think we're supposed to get these ideas, these ideas of purity, of something that is going to be preserved or endure, and even the idea of something costly. Something that isn't necessarily just easily acquired, but it is something you go out and purchase. And it has been said, this is something I heard, I don't have the source. There's a saying in this time, once you ate a man's salt, you are his friend for life. And that's kind of this idea, eternal friendship, this friendship that is preserved, this relationship that you're sharing that is costly. And these are the ideas that need to come to mind as we get into this salt of the covenant. So that language was kind of unique, and that's why I wanted to point it out in the text. I don't think that's something we talk enough about. Questions or comments then through number 1 on the study guide? Or anything else on chapter 2? So we're going to get into chapter 3 now. So chapter 3, I've entitled The Peace Offering. And again, this isn't an offering that's intended to make peace with God. Maybe that's more of what we associate or think about with the atonement offering. And Lord willing, on Sunday, we're going to just do a whole study on the word atonement. Because again, that's a word that we see a lot in the text that maybe we don't have a clear understanding of what it means. So this isn't making peace with God, but rather this idea of because I have peace with God, I get to enjoy fellowship with God and fellowship with his people. So this peace offering was divided into thirds. So you have a portion going to God, a portion going to the priest, and a portion going to the offerer, the one making the sacrifice. So again, you see some of this imagery or this language used that because I have peace with God, I'm going to enjoy fellowship with God, fellowship with his people, symbolized as the priest, and then I'm a part of that as well in the offerer getting to partake in this. Looking at some of this language in chapter 3, though, we're going to get to question 2. What is the most repeated word in this chapter? Not offer. Sorry? Not blood. Not sacrifice. Fat. So that's odd that in chapter 3, the most repeated word is fat. And again, I listed the verses up here. You see it in 3, 4, 9, 10, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And in some of those verses, it's repeated multiple times. The fat, the fat, the fat, the fatty tail. These are the things that you're supposed to offer to God. And so again, we have to ask the question, why is God spending a whole chapter talking about fat? Like, what is his point? What is he trying to show or get us to understand? And again, we see language of the blood. We saw in chapter 1, the blood is something that is repeated. Blood is going to be repeated throughout the book of Leviticus. We're going to see why as we move on in the class, specifically where this verse comes from in Leviticus 17:14. Blood is representing something. So what is fat representing? Okay, so that you have this abundance, you have this great blessing. And why does God want the fat? Okay, there's a sweet-smelling aroma. What? If you've never had a brisket, like, you're missing out. I love the lean of a brisket. Now, this is why I love the lean part of the brisket. If you can make a delicious lean, then the point that has all that marbling is like going to be out of this world. We understand, like, for the most part, like, yeah, ribeyes, like those kinds of Wagyu meats, like, man, those marbleized meats, those are delicious, they're savory. And it's not that God has a mouth, it's not that God has a physical nose and he's like, man, that fat sure smells good. I love having my biscuits made with, that kind of shortening. It's this idea that you're giving the best to God. Blood is representative of life. Give the blood to God. Blood is representative of the purity that needs to happen because there's uncleanliness in the land and in the people. The fat represents giving the best to God. This sheep that he mentions, and the sheep that he mentions with the tail, down in, let's see, I can't find where's the verse that mentions the sheep's tail in chapter 3? Okay, verse 9, from the sacrifice he is offering, he shall bring as an offering to the Lord its fat, its entire fat tail. So obviously most sheep don't necessarily have fat tails. Well, in this century, in this part of the country, they were known to have sheep that had these fatty tails, some of them weighing up to the tails, not like just the sheep, up to 60 pounds. It's a significant amount of fat that would have been found in this tail. And again, it's giving the best to God. The other word that's repeated a lot in this chapter, and I didn't count how many times, is the word kidneys. Like, God makes special emphasis of the kidneys. Anyone have any idea why God is talking about the fat and kidneys? Kurt?
I'm not a medical doctor, but my understanding of the kidney's function is it's a purification system for the body's blood.
Okay, yeah, there is that language too, as far as what the kidneys might represent. I am also not a medical doctor, nor am I a vet, so I had to confirm that this is true. In animals especially, most of the organs are covered or surrounded by fat, especially the kidneys. For instance, like our liver is pretty fatty. If you enjoy eating that sort of stuff, you understand the richness that is maybe appealing. And obviously I don't like liver, so that's why it's kind of disgusting to me. But like my mom, she loves it. Like that's like one of her favorite things. You understand that there's a richness to that. Well, even something like the kidneys that's encompassed or covered in fat takes work to get to. It's something that you really have to dig out, especially in an animal. And not only are you digging this out and working hard for it, but you're giving, again, this representation of the best to God. So when we see these words and this language, it's not just something that we need to overlook. We really understand what the point of like chapter 3 is, that if you're going to really enjoy this relationship, this relationship of the covenant, this enduring relationship that is costly with the Lord, it's going to come through two means. First of all, by giving him the best. So you're giving to him the fat, and then you're also giving him your life as represented in the blood. That idea is so pivotal to understanding why these voluntary sacrifices are things that, if they're voluntary, why does God put so many restrictions on them, or why does God put so many specifications? If I'm bringing this voluntarily to God, don't I get to decide what it is or what I'm giving to him? And no, God says, look, these are things that they are voluntary. You don't have to do them, but if you choose to do them, if you choose to participate in this, then there are expectations that I have that, again, are going to represent peace and life that you get to enjoy with me. So, questions or comments through chapter 3? Or any other observations from the text? Yes, Aaron.
I always think it's interesting when they have things that burn up on the offering.
Sorry, can you repeat?
When they have things that they burn up totally.
Yes.
In the sense that sometimes, you give this animal and the priest eats it, and you think, okay, but it's like, this is something that's very expensive, and you don't have very much of it, and it's just totally burnt up. And in like a worldly way of thinking, like, what a waste, it's like, it takes a lot of faith and commitment to do that.
You made a comment. I'm going to reserve commenting on it because I'm going to make a point about that later in the text that I think we're supposed to intentionally get from that. Aaron was mentioning this is a costly thing. Giving this to God is something that is very costly, and it seems like a lot of waste was your word, and I used the same word. I'm not picking on you today. But yeah, it seems like, what a waste. Like, why would you slaughter and kill this animal and cut out the organs and go through all this trouble if it's just going to be burned up? Like, just save that, throw the animal on there, blood and all maybe, and then, it's so convenient and it's so easy. But again, I will wait to comment on that later because I think there is a point as to why we might view it and say that looks wasteful, and in fact, what is going on there. Brother David.
Just a comment about through all the sacrifices, there are times when God will ask for hundreds or even thousands of sacrifices at one time. And you can imagine the blood and the flies and the stink.
Yeah.
It's all a reminder to us of what God thinks about our sin.
Amen. Amen.
A reminder to us of how bad sin is, and it
I don't know why it seems like from like the 1980s on, there was this idea that became prevalent amongst Christians that we need to get away from this wrath of God, that we need to get away from seeing a vengeful, angry God. And yet, when you read the scriptures in its whole, in its entirety, you see, no, God is very angry with sin. Like, that's not something that he delights in, and that's not something that he takes pleasure in. In fact, like, yeah, that there's a very real wrath to be faced when it comes to my sins before this holy God. And we need to understand a lot of this grace, compassion, love, mercy, but also understand the disgustingness of our sin. And we describe this a little bit in chapter 1, going towards the altar to give your burnt offering. Like, just imagine like trying to bring this animal with you, and maybe it's fighting, maybe it doesn't want to go, and then you're pressing in on this animal. And again, you're doing all this. Everything that you could do for this animal or to this animal in chapter 1, you're doing. What you can't do, the priest will take care of, but it's a very involved process. And again, just imagine seeing and feeling and witnessing all this happening simply because you chose to be unloving towards your neighbor. You chose to neglect the poor. You chose to seek after this desire that you had. It is a very real thing that we need to look at when we see what our sin does to our relationship with God. Any other questions, comments, observations? We're going to see that more clearly here in chapter 4. Yes, Kurt. And then we'll go with Mike.
One additional thing, as we were talking, I was looking at commentary, JP, about fat. So fat is actually the stored energy capacity in the human body, and then the chemical process to turn it into energy is unique to think about with what God is doing. So to think about energy expended for us today in our support and work for the Lord, the energy expended to bring that animal to the altar. It's interesting that the fat is emphasized as the energy expended towards God.
That's it. Yeah.
In the case of the sacrifice was in our today.
That's an interesting observation. I had not considered that. That's neat. Mike.
One thing that, to me, is, at least when I read it, becomes apparent as you go through this, is the complexity of this system of sacrifice.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too general, but whenever you compare it to the simplicity of the sacrifice that we have, I think I understand, in part at least, why Paul emphasizes the one being so much better. It's a part of that. It's not the only part of it, but this would be so difficult for people to do.
Yeah.
And to complete it correctly and consistently. And whenever something came that it was one sacrifice for all times, that has to be something that for these people is just foreign with the hundreds of years of sacrifices that they've been involved in. So it comes across to me to be something that may be part of the reason why it was so difficult for the Jews to really get their mind wrapped around it.
Think about how much work it takes just to, again, assemble together. Like tonight, I got home, I changed out of my t-shirt, and then I didn't iron a shirt. Like, I was like, oh, what shirt is already ironed? Because if I don't have an iron shirt, well, I'm not taking the time to iron a shirt. That's too much preparation. That's too much work for me to put into coming. And then, you know, on Sundays, like, again, if I don't iron a shirt on Saturday, like, man, I hope I have, you know, something tucked away and it looks organized. If you see me with a sport coat on, then you know, like, I didn't iron. But we don't go through that kind of preparation. Like, we don't go through that kind of effort to make sure that we finish our Bible classes, that our kids are prepared for their Bible class, that there's enough gas in the car so I don't have to stop on the way to services, that I've organized the breakfast. And you think about what you're saying, Michael, about this amount of work. You're like, I don't know that I would have done that. I don't know that it was worth it to do that. Because if I don't see that it's worth it to give my best to God now, and we can start making application, like we can make it now. Do I give my best to God when I study and I read his word? Or am I just kind of doing it while I'm falling asleep in my bed so I can say, well, hey, I got in my chapter today. Do I give my best to God in terms of my prayer life and how much time I spend talking to him? Do I give my best to God? And you can make your own application there. Well, these are questions that we need to apply to ourselves. And then looking at the blood, have I really surrendered my life to the Lord? Because that's what he's asking for. And he hasn't changed that. He says, give me your life, give me your best. And God has set the precedence by giving us his best and giving us life as well. Great comments, great observations and discussion. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, why does it say a couple of times about the sons of Aaron throwing the blood on the side of the altar?
It's a great question. So why does the text repeat several times that the sons of Aaron take the blood and throw it on the altar? The sons of Aaron, that language is talking about the priests. So we would just say priests. We're simplifying it when we talk like that. The sprinkling of the blood around the altar or on the altar is again this semblance of the blood is cleansing the impurities that are around there. You need to be pure to go into the presence of God. And there's impurities that exist. So the blood is cleansing and washing away those impurities. So that's why we see that language repeated. Thank you for asking your question. Any other questions or comments? So we get into chapter 4. I'm so excited for chapter 4, y'all. I forgot how much I love this chapter. So there's a lot of language. I don't necessarily need y'all to memorize or study this. But in terms of understanding what's happening in chapter 4, so we're going to come back to verse 1 in a minute, but we see the first group mentioned here is if a priest sins, and again, this is for unintentional sin, not intentional sin. You are not supposed to sin intentionally. This is sin committed in ignorance, or again, sin that you didn't know or realize that you committed at the time. But the priest comes in, and this was such unique language. So the high priest comes in, and his sins obviously have a big impact on the people. He's the representative of the people. And so when he commits a sin, he has certain things that he needs to do. Again, to just say language that maybe we're slightly more familiar with, Hebrews 9. Blood and fat is used in Hebrews 9. And again, that's representative of a covenant. So here we get into the first 12 verses of of Leviticus 4. And look at what the high priest is called to do. So he's called to take this blood, as our brother asked, and he's called to sprinkle it. And man, my animation didn't work. There we go. The things that the priest is doing and then the way in which he has to make restitution is very unique in chapter 4 as opposed to any of the other sin offerings that we're going to look at in the book of Leviticus. So this is for a very specific sin. This is not dealing with general sin. This is the high priest's sin. Not only that, but it's a known sin. So something that he became aware of and others became aware of. So that's what that means. It's a known sin. It's unintentional. And that's pivotal to understand chapter 4, that these are unintentional sins or sins committed in ignorance. You didn't know at the time that you were sinning. We're not supposed to be committing intentional sin. So there's your verse citations for that. But this is what I found interesting. This sacrifice that's made uses the blood in a different way than we're going to see in other sacrifices. So he takes the blood, and where does he sprinkle it? Or where does he take the blood to? Look at the text here. Look at verse 6. Where is he taking the blood in verse 6? Okay, so the veil. Verse 7, where is the blood going? The altar of incense. And verse 10, where is the blood going? Or not, the sacrifice, in verse 10. Where's the sacrifice going? Okay, so that's where you're going to take it, because you're not going to get to participate in this. You as a priest can't eat this animal that you're supposed to be sacrificing. But look at verse 10. Where is the sacrifice taken to, or where is it offered? On the altar of what? Burnt offering. So we've already studied that in chapter 1. Again, this is intentional language here. So you're looking at the progression of these altars, and again, you're taking the blood to the veil. That is like the closest you can get into the presence of God. And that's where you're starting to sprinkle this blood. Then you get to this language later on in Leviticus. What's important about the blood? The blood is identifying life, or symbolic of life. So what does this have to do with the high priest and what he's called to do in these verses? Well, again, the high priest is representing the nation as a whole. When the high priest is in unintentional sin and it's become known to him and known to others, what does he need to do? He needs to go and sprinkle this blood on the veil. What is the veil representing? God's presence in their life, right? It's the closest I can get to the holiness of God, so I'm going to literally take this blood and sprinkle it to open up access to the presence of God. Then he takes it and goes to the altar of incense. What is the altar of incense symbolic of? It's symbolic of communication and prayer to God. You see the incense being used throughout the Old Testament as prayer. The idea of frankincense, for instance, with the grain offering is symbolic of prayer, communication with God. So the sin of the people, as representative in the high priest sin, is inhibiting the prayers, and then it's inhibiting our atonement. So again, he takes this sacrifice and puts it on the burnt offering altar, again, representing what we've already studied in chapter 1 of this atoning process. So all these things are things that the high priest has to do that make application to us today. There is so much more to be seen in this language, but again, the other thing that our brother pointed out in verse 12 that's important to look at here is the high priest isn't going to gain benefit from sinning. Like, when the high priest can partake of other sacrifices, they can't sin, offer an animal, and then benefit from that animal. That animal is being removed from the presence of his people. So as we start looking at some of this language, specifically chapter 4, verses 12 through 21, we get into this second category, this second natural division in the text. And this is a sacrifice for the whole congregation. Here's my question. So the whole congregation, the whole people of Israel, sin. Are we required then in this text to offer a goat, a sheep, a lamb, a bull, a dove for every single person that's in the congregation or in the people? What is being offered? I heard someone say something. One what? One bull. We established the bull is costly. It's the most expensive out of any of the sacrifices that we can give. It's from the herd, it's not from the flock, it's not from the birds. So, one bull to atone for the sins of the entire congregation. Again, think about the implications of that. Think about what God is saying. I will allow you to sacrifice one bull for everyone's sins. Is that not a demonstration of God's grace and God's understanding of what he's doing? Look at the language then in verse 20. He shall also do with the bull just as he did with the bull of the sin offering. Thus he shall do it. So the priest shall make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. I think sometimes we believe that under the old covenant, they weren't forgiven. And the language that I've heard often used is their sins were rolled forward. That's not what the text says, nor is that what God says about sin. I'll take a famous example. And again, these verses are cited up here. 2 Samuel 12:13. David sins. This is following the sin of Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah, his lying, all that stuff. And he's told that God has already removed his sin. But I thought Hebrews taught the blood of bulls and goats couldn't take away sin. So, where are we at here? God says, I forgave them. Why could God say that? Because, as Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3, before the foundation of the world, he already knew he was going to send Jesus. He is accepting these offerings for the forgiveness of sin, not based on the animal, but based on the sacrifice of Jesus to come, because God knows that's going to happen. Now, did the Jews know that? No. Did they understand that? No. They understood, I give my animal, God forgives me. And then I'll give my animal, and God forgives me. Does the blood of bulls and goats take away sin? No. Does water take away sin? No. It's just water. Like, there's nothing special. I don't know if the baptistry is full or not. It fills in 3 minutes. That was a big selling point from the elders. It's just water. And I don't imagine it's water that's being blessed as it's coming out. It's just water. In the same way that we understand, it's not the water bringing salvation. It is the representation of our death, burial, and resurrection with Christ, as Paul writes in Romans 6. That's what's happening with these animals. Why can one bull be offered as a sacrifice for the sins of the whole congregation? Because it's not the animal that God is delighting in or using to pacify the sins. It is what is to come. And it's the same idea. And if we can think about that and start understanding that they had forgiveness, because God said they had forgiveness in the Old Testament, we have forgiveness too, not based on our deeds or on our righteousness, but what is done in Christ. Kurt. Or, yeah, perhaps, or perhaps they're doing the same thing we're doing and doing these things based on faith. Marching around a wall 7 times doesn't make a wall fall down. We can test it after services and try to bring this building down. What made the walls come down? It was the faith that in obedience, I'll do what God has instructed me to do. And then because I've acted in faith and I've met God's conditions in faith and I've obeyed him in faith, the result will happen. I thought I saw another hand. All right, we didn't make it to chapter 5, sorry. But chapter 4 is such an amazing chapter. And I'll go ahead and give you this answer so we don't have to come back to it. So it has 4 clear divisions: the sin of the high priest, the sin of the whole congregation, the sin of the ruler, and the sin of a common person or the commoner. Those are the natural divisions that you see in chapter 4. And again, as you read, as you study, as you prepare for these things, try to pay attention to that language. Really look at what the text is saying and how you could naturally divide these things. So as you read, you can read with understanding. Any final questions, comments, or observations in the text? All right, if not, we're going to start with chapter 5, Lord willing, next Wednesday. I'll include the section that you've already done in the study guide. Be looking by Friday night for the homework for Sunday. The homework for Sunday, be looking for that on Friday night. I haven't published it yet. I'm still trying to get ahead, so we'll have those things available as we progress in this class. So Lord willing, on Sunday, we'll look at this concept and this word study of atonement. So y'all are dismissed. Thank you so much for your attention and participation.